They told you it was just a scandal, but what if it was something far darker? What if the truth was buried, not by accident, but by design? An ex-insider is speaking, and the silence around this is not normal. Why do powerful names vanish from the story again and again? This is not just corruption, this is control, influence, and something spiritual behind it. And what you're about to hear was never meant to reach you. You were told this was just another powerful man, another scandal, another fallen figure. But that version was controlled, filtered, sanitized, because what you're looking at is not just a man, it's a system, and systems like this don't rise overnight. They are built in darkness, layer by layer, protected by silence, funded by power, and enforced by fear. I was once part of circles where influence was currency, where access to powerful people meant protection, and where information was never what it seemed. You need to understand something clearly. These exist, they don't operate in the open. They move behind closed doors. Private islands, private jets, private conversations. Nothing is accidental, everything is strategic. You're told it's about money. You're told it's about power. But that's only the surface, because the deeper truth is control. Total control. Control over people. Control over secrets. Control over silence. And the media, the very system meant to expose truth, becomes part of the cover. Have you ever wondered why certain names disappear? Why some faces are shown again and again, while others are erased completely? That's not coincidence. That's selection. That's narrative control. I remember sitting in rooms where conversations never left the walls, where people spoke freely, not because they were innocent, but because they knew they were protected. Protected by connections, protected by influence, protected by a system that ensures exposure never reaches the full truth. And you, watching from the outside, are only given fragments, pieces of a puzzle that never fully connects. Because if it did, it would shake everything. You would begin to question everything you've been told. You would begin to see patterns, patterns of silence, patterns of protection, patterns of selective outrage. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. There is a reason why certain investigations stall, a reason why certain documents remain hidden, a reason why certain testimonies are discredited before they are even heard. This is not random failure. This is strategic limitation. Because the moment the full truth surfaces, it threatens people who are not supposed to be touched. And when powerful individuals are at risk, systems activate, narratives shift, focus is redirected. You've seen it happen. A story explodes, then suddenly fades. Questions rise, then suddenly disappear. Voices speak, then suddenly go silent. And you're left wondering, what just happened? Why did it stop? Who decided it was over? I'm telling you, it never stopped, it just moved out of your sight. Because networks like this don't collapse easily. They adapt, they evolve, they relocate, and most importantly, they protect themselves. But here's where it goes deeper, far deeper than what you've been told. Because behind every system like this, there is a spiritual layer, a darkness that feeds off secrecy, control, and exploitation. You may not understand it at first, but there are forces that thrive in hidden corruption, forces that gain influence when truth is buried. And when people are silenced, those forces grow stronger. That's why exposure is fought so aggressively, not just to protect people, but to protect what operates behind them. I've seen how secrecy becomes a shield, how fear becomes a weapon, how silence becomes a prison. And once someone is inside that system, leaving is not simple, because the deeper you go, the more you know. And the more you know, the more dangerous it becomes to speak. That's why so many remain silent. Not because nothing happened, but because the cost of truth is too high. Reputation, freedom, safety, all at risk. You have to understand, this is not about one person, not about one case, not about one moment in history. This is about a pattern, a structure, a network that operates in layers. And what you see publicly is only the outer shell. The real operations are buried deep, hidden beneath layers of influence, protected by systems designed to never fully expose themselves. And the media, instead of digging deeper, often stops where it's told to stop, because pushing further means stepping into dangerous territory, territory that threatens careers, threatens access, threatens safety. So stories are shaped, details are trimmed, focus is narrowed, and the public is given a version that feels complete but isn't. You are meant to believe it ended, that justice was served, that the system worked, but deep down Something doesn't feel right. You feel the gaps. Sense the missing pieces. That uneasiness, that feeling that something bigger is hidden, that's not your imagination. That's awareness. And awareness is the first step to seeing beyond the surface. Because once you begin to question, once you refuse to accept the controlled narrative, you step outside the system of influence. And that's exactly what they don't want. They want silence. They want distraction. They want you to move on, forget, ignore. But the truth doesn't disappear. It waits. And right now, you are closer to it than you've ever been. You are trained to trust what is repeated, to believe what is shown often, to accept what everyone else seems to accept. But what happens when repetition is used as a weapon? What happens when the same version of a story is pushed, not because it is true, but because it is controlled? This is where the deeper layer begins, because networks like this don't just operate in secrecy, they operate through influence, influence over narratives, influence over perception, influence over what you are allowed to question. I remember how information moved in those circles, not randomly, not freely, but strategically. Every leak had a purpose, every exposure had a limit, every silence had a reason. Nothing was ever released without calculation, because information is power. And controlling information means controlling reality. You think you're seeing everything, but you're seeing what passed through filters. Filters designed to protect certain names, certain connections, certain structures that cannot be exposed all at once. That's why you see partial truths, fragments that feel heavy but incomplete. You're given enough to react, but not enough to fully understand. And while you're reacting, the deeper layers remain untouched. Have you ever noticed how quickly attention shifts? One moment, the world is focused. The next moment, something else takes over. A new headline, a new crisis, a new distraction. And just like that, previous story fades into the background. That's not accidental. That's redirection. Because sustained attention is dangerous to hidden systems. If people keep looking, if people keep asking, if people refuse to move on, truth starts to surface, and that cannot be allowed. So the cycle continues. Expose just enough, distract immediately, control the narrative, and close the door before deeper questions arise. You've seen it, but now you're beginning to recognize it. And once you recognize the pattern, you start to break free from it. But there's something even darker beneath this, something most people are never told. Because this isn't just about controlling what you see, it's about controlling what you believe is possible. You've been conditioned to think these networks are rare, that they are isolated incidents, that once exposed they disappear. But that belief is part of the illusion, because systems like this don't exist in isolation. They are connected, layered, embedded within. Structures that appear normal on the surface, and that's what makes them so difficult to expose. They don't look like what you expect. They don't operate like obvious criminal organizations. They blend in. They wear legitimacy. They sit in positions of trust. And that's why so many people dismiss the deeper truth, because it challenges everything they've been taught. It forces them to confront uncomfortable realities. It forces them to ask, who can I trust? What is real? And how deep does this actually go? I've seen people come close to asking those questions and then stop because the weight of the answer is too heavy, too unsettling, too dangerous. So they turn away. They accept the simplified version. They move on. And the system continues untouched. But you're not meant to turn away. You're meant to see, to question, to recognize the layers. Because awareness breaks control. And control is what these systems rely on. Not just control over actions, but control over perception, control over belief, control over what you think is possible. And when you begin to see beyond that control, you start to understand something critical. This is not just about events. This is about influence over entire systems of thought, over what society accepts as truth, over what gets labeled as conspiracy and what gets labeled as fact. Because once something is labeled, most people stop questioning it. They accept the label and move on. That's how deeper truths stay hidden in plain sight. They are dismissed before they are even explored. And anyone who pushes further is isolated, discredited, silenced. I've seen how quickly someone can go from being heard to being erased, not physically, but socially, digitally, reputationally. Their voice disappears, their credibility is attacked, their message is buried, and the system moves forward as if they never existed. That's the power of narrative control. And it's far more effective than force, because it doesn't look like control. It looks like consensus. It looks like public opinion. It looks like truth, but it's shaped, guided, directed. And once you understand that, You begin to see why certain stories never reach full exposure, why certain questions are never fully answered, why certain connections are never fully explored. Because the moment those connections become clear, it reveals something much bigger, something systemic, something deeply rooted, something that cannot be easily dismantled. And that's why the media stops where it stops. Not always because they want to, but because they have to. Because going further means stepping into territory that is not just risky, but controlled. And when territory is controlled, truth becomes restricted. But here's what they don't expect: they don't expect you to keep thinking, to keep questioning, to keep seeing beyond the surface. Because once enough people do that, the system begins to weaken, not instantly, not visibly, but gradually. Because control relies on agreement. And when that agreement starts to break, so does the illusion. You are not powerless in this. Your awareness matters. Your refusal to accept incomplete truth matters. Your willingness to look deeper matters. Because every system built on secrecy fears exposure. And exposure doesn't always start with a headline. Sometimes it starts with a single person who refuses to look away. Now you're stepping into the part they never explain. Not on the news, not in documentaries, not in public conversations. Because this is where the surface narrative ends and the hidden layer begins. You've already seen the patterns: control, silence, selective exposure. But what drives all of this? What sustains the system, this protected, this calculated, this untouchable? It's not just power. It's not just influence. It's something deeper. Something that feeds off secrecy. Because the darker a system becomes, the more it depends on remaining hidden. And once you understand that, you begin to see why exposure is treated like a threat, not a solution. In those inner circles, there was an unspoken rule: you don't just protect people, you protect what they are connected to. And those connections run deeper than most people can imagine. It's not always direct, it's not always visible, but it's there. Layers of influence tied together in ways that make separation almost impossible. That's why when one piece is exposed, the rest doesn't collapse, because it's designed not to. It's designed to absorb impact, to redirect attention, to sacrifice smaller pieces while protecting the core. And that's exactly what you've seen happen. A name surfaces, a scandal explodes, the world reacts, and then silence, but not real closure, controlled closure. Because the system decides when something is over, not the truth, not justice, the system. And when the system decides, everything shifts. Documents stop moving, voices stop being amplified, investigations lose momentum, and the story is sealed. But what you don't see is what continues behind that seal. Because just because something disappears from public view doesn't mean it stopped existing. It just means it moved deeper, further away from your reach, further into protected spaces. That's where the real operations continue, out of sight, out of question, out of accountability. I've watched how quickly environments change when exposure gets close. Energy shifts, conversations tighten, people become careful. Not because they're afraid of being caught, but because they're trained to survive exposure. They know how to respond, how to redirect, how to disappear when necessary, and how to reappear under a different form. That's how these systems endure. They don't stay fixed, they adapt, they evolve, they learn from every exposure. Every mistake becomes a lesson, every leak becomes a blueprint for stronger concealment. And with every cycle, they become harder to detect, harder to understand, harder to dismantle. Here's the part that most people never realize: the longer something operates in secrecy, the more normalized it becomes within its own environment. What would shock you becomes routine to them. What would break you becomes acceptable to them, because when accountability is removed, limits disappear. And once limits disappear, anything becomes possible. That's the danger of hidden systems. Not just what they do, but what they become over time. Unchecked, unquestioned, unstoppable, unless something disrupts it. And that disruption is truth, real truth, not controlled narratives, not partial exposure, but full, undeniable, unfiltered truth. That's the one thing these systems cannot survive. Because truth doesn't negotiate, it doesn't adjust, it doesn't protect power. It reveals. And once something is fully revealed, it loses its shield. That's why truth is resisted so aggressively. Not just by individuals, but by systems. Because truth threatens structure, it threatens stability, threatens everything that was built in secrecy. And when something threatens that much, it is treated as a danger, not a necessity. That's why people who get close to the truth often face resistance, not always obvious, not always direct, but consistent, persistent strategy. They are ignored, discredited, distracted, or overwhelmed until they either stop or disappear from the conversation. And when they do, the system breathes again. It resets and continues. But here's what changes everything: when people don't stop, when questions don't fade, when awareness continues to grow. Because systems like this depend on one thing more than anything else: silence. And silence is powerful, but it's also fragile. Because the moment it breaks, everything starts to shift. Not instantly, not dramatically, but inevitably. Because once something hidden is consistently exposed, it cannot return to complete darkness, no matter how much control is applied, no matter how much influence is used. Because awareness spreads quietly, steadily, unstoppably. And you are part of that awareness. You're no longer seeing the surface, you're seeing the patterns, the layers, the structure. And once you see that, you cannot go back to ignorance. You cannot unlearn it. You cannot ignore it. That's why this moment matters. Because awareness is not just information, it's responsibility. And what you do with it determines whether the system remains hidden. Now you've seen the layers, the silence, the control, the patterns that repeat again and again. But this is the moment where everything becomes personal. Because this is no longer just about them, it's about you, your awareness, your discernment, your refusal to accept what is incomplete. You've been positioned in a world where information is constant but truth is selective, where noise is amplified and clarity is buried. And if you're not careful, you don't just observe the system, you become influenced by it, quietly, gradually, without even realizing it. That's how control expands. Not just through power, but through passive acceptance, through distraction, through emotional fatigue. Because when you're overwhelmed, you stop questioning. When you're distracted, you stop paying attention. And when you stop paying attention, the system operates freely. That's why this isn't just about exposure. It's about awakening, a shift in how you see, how you process, how do you respond. Because once you awaken to the patterns, you stop reacting emotionally and start thinking strategically. You stop consuming everything blindly and start discerning what is real, what is manipulated, what is missing. That's where your strength begins. Not in fear, not in confusion, but in clarity. And clarity is dangerous to systems built on deception. Because a clear mind cannot be easily controlled. It cannot be easily redirected. It cannot be easily silenced. That's why awareness alone is not enough. You must guard it, strengthen it, apply it daily, in what you watch, in what you believe, in what you repeat to others. Because influence doesn't just come from above, it spreads through people, through conversations, through shared narratives. And if you're not careful, you can unknowingly pass along incomplete truth, reinforcing the very system you're trying to understand. That's why discernment matters. Not everything presented as truth is truth, not everything dismissed as false is false. You must learn to pause, to question, to observe without immediately accepting, because the first version of a story is rarely the full version, and the loudest voices are not always the most accurate. This is where your role becomes critical, because systems like this don't just rely on secrecy, they rely on participation. Not intentional participation, but passive, unquestioned, unaware participation. People repeating what they hear, believing what is presented, moving on without digging deeper. That's how control sustains itself. But when even one person steps out of that cycle, it creates disruption. And when many people do it, it creates pressure. Pressure that forces cracks, pressure that reveals inconsistencies, pressure that exposes what was meant to stay hidden. You don't need power to create that pressure. You don't need status. You don't need influence. You need awareness and the courage to hold on to it, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it challenges what you've believed, even when others don't understand. Because truth is not always popular. It's not always easy, but it is necessary. And the more you align with it, the less control systems have over you. That's where real freedom begins. Not in what you're told, but in what you choose to see, what you choose to question, what you refuse to ignore. Because once you reach that point, you cannot be easily manipulated. You cannot be easily distracted. You cannot be easily silenced. And that is the greatest threat to any system built on deception. A person who sees clearly, a person who thinks independently, a person who refuses to accept incomplete truths. That's why this moment matters. Because you're not just hearing information, you're stepping into awareness. And awareness changes everything. It changes how you interpret the world, how you respond to narratives, how you engage with information. And most importantly, how you protect your mind. Because your mind is the battlefield, not physically, but mentally, through ideas, through narratives, through influence. And once you understand that, you begin to guard it differently. You become intentional, focused, alert, not paranoid, but aware. And awareness is not weakness, it's strength, it's clarity, it's protection. And in a world where information is constantly shifting, that clarity is your advantage. Because while others are reacting, you are observing. While others are accepting, you are questioning. While others are moving on, you are looking deeper. And that difference changes everything, because systems like this depend on one thing: unquestioned belief. And the moment that belief is challenged, their foundation begins to shake, not instantly, but inevitably. Because truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried, no matter how heavily it's controlled, no matter how long it's hidden. And when it does, it changes everything, not just for them, but for you. Because once truth becomes clear, you step into a level of understanding that cannot be taken away. Now you see it, not just the surface, but the system behind it. You are no longer blind to the patterns, no longer controlled by incomplete truth. This is where your awareness becomes power, where your clarity becomes protection. Stand firm in what you now see and do not return to silence, because truth is rising and you are part of that awakening. And nothing built in darkness can survive the light forever.